The champagne glass in Vivian Cole's hand had gone warm before she ever touched it. But she raised it anyway when the string quartet stopped mid-phrase and every camera in the Windermere ballroom turned toward her like a single hungry eye. Grant Ashford was on one knee. The ring in his hand caught the chandelier light and threw it across the marble floor in a thin, trembling line. And for exactly 3 seconds, Vivian let the room believe she was about to say yes. Then she set the glass down on a passing tray without looking at it, the way she set down anything that had already served its purpose. "Before I answer," she said, and her voice carried without her needing to raise it, "I'd love for you to tell everyone here what your lawyer requested from my family office last Tuesday." Grant's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did a small collapse no one else in the room would have caught. "A prenuptial disclosure schedule," Vivian went on. "Itemized. Real estate holdings, brand valuation, projected earnings through the next fiscal year. That's a very thorough thing to ask for from a man who says he fell in love with me at a charity gala." She smiled at him, the kind of smile that photographed beautifully and meant nothing at all. "I'm going to say no, Grant. Not because the ring isn't lovely. Because you already knew the price of everything. Except me." She was gone from the ballroom before the murmuring reached its peak, her heels silent against the marble, because she had trained herself years ago never to walk like a woman fleeing anything. Her driver was 3 minutes late, which never happened, and instead of waiting under the awning, she walked half a block into a rain that had started sometime during Grant's speech and had not bothered to announce itself. The city blurred into smears of gold and red through the wet air, and for once, nobody recognized her, because no one expected the woman on every business magazine cover this quarter to be standing alone on a curb in a soaked silk dress, laughing quietly at nothing in particular. That was when she heard it. A man's voice, pitched low and urgent, not shouting exactly, but stretched thin the way voices get right before something goes wrong. She turned and saw him at the mouth of the alley beside the parking garage, one arm wrapped tight around a small girl who could not have been older than 5. His body angled between her and a delivery van that was backing up too fast, its driver clearly not checking his mirrors. Vivian did not think. She crossed the distance in 4 strides and slammed her palm against the side of the van hard enough to bruise, shouting a single word that made the driver slam the brakes so violently the whole vehicle groaned on its frame. For a moment, nobody moved. The man was breathing like he had run a mile, crouched low with his daughter's face pressed into his shoulder, and when he finally looked up at Vivian, his eyes were not grateful in the practiced, performative way people's eyes usually were when they realized who had just helped them. They were simply relieved, raw and unguarded, the way a person looks when the worst thing that almost happened did not happen. "She's fine," he said, more to himself than to Vivian, running a hand over the girl's damp hair. "Sophie, baby, you're fine. Look at me. You're fine." Sophie whimpered once, and then, with the terrifying speed of small children, decided she was fine indeed, and asked if the puddle by her shoe was deep enough to jump in. That was the first time Vivian Cole laughed in front of a stranger, without calculating how it would look. "You should get her out of the rain," Vivian said, because it was easier than examining why her hands were still shaking slightly, and not from the cold. The man nodded, hoisted Sophie onto his hip with the practiced economy of someone who had done it 1,000 times alone, and only then seemed to actually see Vivian. The ruined silk dress, the makeup starting to run at the corner of one eye. A woman standing in the rain outside a 5-star hotel with no umbrella and no entourage. "Thank you," he said simply. "I mean it. I wasn't watching that van closely enough. I was watching her, and you saw it before I did." There was no flattery in it, no attempt to linger, no glance downward to assess the dress or upward to place her face against some memory of a magazine cover. He simply meant the words and seemed ready to walk away the moment he'd said them, which unsettled Vivian more than the near accident had. "You're bleeding," she said, nodding at his forearm, where a thin line of red had opened just above his rolled sleeve, probably scraped against the van's mirror in the last second before he'd pulled Sophie back. He glanced at it like it was someone else's arm. "It's nothing. Happens at the shop all the time." Vivian did not ask what shop. She reached into her small clutch, found the folded handkerchief she always carried out of an old habit her grandmother had drilled into her, and held it out. He hesitated for exactly 1 second, the hesitation of a man who did not like accepting things he could not immediately return, and then took it, pressing it to the cut with a quiet word of thanks. Sophie, from the safety of his hip, studied Vivian with the frank, merciless attention only small children are capable of. "Are you a princess?" she asked. "You look like a princess who fell in a lake." "Something like that," Vivian said, and for the first time all evening, the smile on her face was not for anyone's benefit, but her own. His name she learned only because Sophie volunteered it without being asked. Was Daniel Reyes. He did not offer a last name of his own accord, did not ask Vivian for hers either, which she noticed the way she noticed everything, filing it away as either remarkable or suspicious, and unable in that moment to decide which. Her car finally arrived, sliding to the curb with her driver full of apologies about traffic on Delancey, and Vivian found herself oddly reluctant to end the conversation. Standing there dripping, while a man she had known for 4 minutes buttoned his daughter into a jacket 2 sizes too big for her. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" Vivian asked, gesturing at the car, and Daniel shook his head before she'd even finished the sentence. "We're not far. Sophie likes rain anyway, don't you?" Trouble. Sophie confirmed this with the enthusiasm of someone whose opinion had just been validated by an adult. Daniel looked at Vivian one more time, and there was something searching in it, not calculating, not the look of a man trying to place a face he half recognized from television, but the look of someone simply trying to understand a stranger who had thrown herself at a moving van without hesitation. "Thank you again," he said. "Really." And then he turned and walked away into the rain with his daughter on his hip, and did not look back, and did not ask for her number, and did not ask her name. Vivian sat in the back of her car for a long moment before she told her driver to go, watching the 2 shapes shrink and disappear around the corner of 53rd Street. Her phone buzzed against her knee, 3 missed calls from her assistant Renata, and 1 text that read only in all capitals, "Where are you? The Ashford thing is already trending." Vivian typed back a single line telling Renata she was fine and to hold every press inquiry until morning, then set the phone face down on the seat beside her, which she almost never did. She thought about the handkerchief, monogrammed with her grandmother's initials, now somewhere in a stranger's pocket, pressed against a scrape he'd gotten protecting his daughter. She thought about the particular quality of his gratitude, how it had contained no request, no opening, no angle. In the world Vivian lived in, gratitude was a currency people spent carefully, always expecting something in return. Daniel Reyes had simply said thank you and walked away. And something about the plainness of it sat in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples she did not yet have a name for. By the time the car pulled into the underground garage of her building, Vivian had already rebuilt the wall she'd let slip for those 4 minutes on the sidewalk. She thought of Marcus, 3 years gone from her life, but never quite gone from the ledger of who she had become, and the particular education he had given her about what men wanted when they looked at Vivian Cole. She thought of the disclosure schedule Grant's lawyer had filed, of the 2 men before him, who had done nearly the same thing with slightly better manners, and of the quiet, methodical test she had built for herself over the years. A private ritual of watching how quickly a man's curiosity turned toward her balance sheet instead of her face. Daniel Reyes hadn't asked her name. That fact alone made him either the most honest man she'd met in years, or some small, cold part of her whispered the most dangerous kind of unknown. She rode the elevator up to her penthouse floor, still soaked through, still holding the ghost weight of a small girl's question in her chest. Are you a princess who fell in a lake and found herself against every instinct she had spent a decade sharpening, hoping the city was small enough that she might see him again? The workshop occupied the ground floor of a converted brick warehouse on the edge of the design district, sandwiched between a defunct print shop and a bakery that scented the whole block with cinnamon every morning at 6, and Vivian told herself 3 separate times on the drive over that she was not doing anything unusual. Cole Atelier's furniture division had contracted with a dozen small restoration shops over the years for custom pieces, bespoke display cabinets, the kind of hand-finished walnut consoles that photographed well in flagship stores. That Reyes Restoration had appeared on the short list Renata handed her that morning was, Vivian told herself, simply a coincidence of the industry being smaller than people assumed. That she had personally requested the shortlist be widened to include shops she did not already have relationships with was a detail she did not examine too closely. She wore plain trousers and the coat without a single visible label. Her hair pulled back, sunglasses pushed up into it rather than over her eyes, and when she stepped through the workshop door, the bell overhead announced her with a small brass chime that felt almost comically modest for a woman who normally announced herself with a fleet of assistants. Daniel was bent over a workbench near the back, sanding the arm of a chair with the unhurried precision of someone who had done the same motion 10,000 times, sawdust catching gold in the light from the high windows. He didn't look up right away. When he did, there was a beat, just a flicker before recognition landed, and Vivian watched it happen with something like relief, because it meant he hadn't spent the last week thinking about their 4 minutes in the rain the way she apparently had. "The Rain Princess," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but wanted to be one. "I didn't expect to see you somewhere dry. I'm here about a commission," Vivian said, which was true, though not the whole truth, and she handed him the folder Renata had prepared without quite meeting his eyes, suddenly aware of how strange it felt to be looked at as an ordinary woman with an ordinary request instead of a name people already had opinions about. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and took the folder, flipping through the specifications for a set of display cases, with the focused quiet of a man who cared more about the wood grain than the client attached to it. "Cole Atelier," he read aloud, and something in his face did register the name this time. A small widening of attention, though not the kind Vivian had learned to dread. "Big client for a shop this size. You work for them?" "Something like that," Vivian said, borrowing the exact phrase she'd used on him a week earlier, and he caught it. She could tell because his eyes narrowed slightly with something like amusement rather than suspicion. He didn't push. That too, she filed away. Sophie appeared from a back room in socked feet, dragging a half-finished wooden horse behind her by a string, and upon seeing Vivian, she abandoned the horse entirely and crossed the workshop floor at a dead sprint. "You came back," she announced, as though Vivian's return confirmed some private theory she'd been nursing all week, and wrapped both arms around Vivian's leg before Daniel could intervene. "Sophie, personal space," he said, though without much conviction, and Vivian found herself crouching down anyway, ruining the crease of her trousers, without caring to ask Sophie whether the wooden horse had a name yet. It did. His name was Biscuit, and he was going to be a racehorse, and also possibly a unicorn, depending on how the ears turned out. Vivian listened to the entire explanation with more genuine attention than she had given the last 4 board presentations combined. And when she glanced up, she caught Daniel watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately place. Something between wariness and quiet surprise, as if the fact that she could sit on a dusty floor and discuss the racehorse aspirations of a wooden toy did not fit whatever category he'd started sorting her into. Over the following 2 weeks, Vivian found reasons. She told herself each one was legitimate, and each one examined individually probably was a fabric swatch that needed comparing in person, a delivery timeline that needed confirming, a design revision that really did require her opinion, since she was, after all, the one who'd approved the original brief. Renata, who had worked for Vivian long enough to recognize a pattern when she saw one, said nothing directly, but began scheduling Vivian's calendar around Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, without being asked, which Vivian noticed and chose not to comment on. Each visit followed a similar shape. Vivian would arrive with some thin professional pretext. Daniel would receive her with the same wry, unhurried patience he brought to everything, and Sophie would appear within 90 seconds to reroute the entire visit toward whatever project currently held her 5-year-old attention. Vivian learned that Daniel's wife had left when Sophie was 8 months old, a fact he mentioned once flatly, without asking for sympathy, and without offering further explanation, in the tone of a man stating a fact about the weather, rather than a wound he was still nursing. She learned he'd built the workshop from nothing after leaving a corporate design job he described only as fine, but not mine, and that he closed the shop at 4 every day without exception because Sophie's school let out at 3:30, and he refused to have anyone else pick her up if he could help it. She learned all of this the way a person learns a language, slowly by immersion, without ever quite deciding to enroll in the course. On the 9th day, a Thursday, Vivian arrived to find Daniel in the middle of what was clearly not a good afternoon. Phone wedged between his shoulder and ear, arguing in tight, controlled sentences with someone about a lumber shipment that had arrived warped and unusable. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, uncharacteristically quiet, watching him with the particular stillness children develop when they've learned to read the weather of an adult's stress. Vivian, without deciding to, crouched down beside her, instead of waiting at the counter. "Bad day for biscuits, Stable?" she asked low enough not to interrupt Daniel's call, and Sophie nodded solemnly. "Daddy says the wood came broken. He gets a voice when the wood comes broken." Vivian glanced up at Daniel at the tension riding his shoulders, at the calculation happening behind his eyes as he did the math on a delay he couldn't afford, and felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with recognition. She knew that particular arithmetic of stress. She had simply never watched someone do it without an army of people to absorb it for him. When he finally hung up, dropping the phone onto the counter with more force than necessary, Vivian was already pulling up a name on her own phone. "I know a supplier in the valley who owes me a favor," she said. "Reclaimed hardwood, good grain, can have it to you by Monday if I call now." Daniel's expression did something complicated. Gratitude warring visibly with something else, something closer to discomfort. "I don't need you to fix this," he said, not unkindly, but firm. "I appreciate it, but I'll figure it out." Vivian lowered the phone slowly. "I wasn't trying to fix anything. I was trying to help." "There's a difference between the two," Daniel said, "and I've learned to be careful about which one people are actually offering." It wasn't an accusation exactly, but it landed with unexpected weight, and Vivian understood with a small, cold jolt that he was not talking only about lumber. She didn't call the supplier. She also didn't leave. She sat on an overturned crate near the window and watched him work through the problem himself, rerouting an order, calling a smaller distributor, absorbing the delay with the same quiet economy he brought to everything. And when he finally exhaled and told Sophie they'd have pizza for dinner as a reward for surviving a difficult Thursday, He looked over at Vivian, still sitting there, and something in his face softened just slightly, an acknowledgement that she had offered to fix, and then, when refused, had simply stayed instead. "You didn't have to wait around for that," he said. "I wanted to," Vivian answered, and meant it more plainly than she'd meant anything and longer than she cared to admit. It was 3 days later, at a charity auction Vivian attended out of obligation rather than interest, that Marcus Whitfield found her near the bar, materializing the way certain men from your past always seem to, uninvited and perfectly timed to catch you off balance. He looked good, which she resented on principle, and his smile carried the same practiced warmth it always had. The warmth that had once fooled her into believing warmth was the same thing as truth. "Vivian," he said, as though 3 years hadn't passed, as though the ink on certain dissolved agreements hadn't dried a long time ago. "You're glowing. New investment paying off, or new man?" She did not answer the question, which he seemed to find more interesting than any answer she could have given. "I heard about Ashford," Marcus went on, swirling his drink. "Rough. You do have a habit of finding men who see the balance sheet before they see you." "I have a habit of learning from my mistakes," Vivian said evenly. "One mistake in particular taught me quite a lot." Marcus's smile didn't waver, but something behind it sharpened, the way it always had, right before he said something designed to unsettle. "Careful, Vivian. Lessons cut both ways. I heard you've been spending time somewhere new. Some little workshop, wasn't it? People talk." He said it lightly, almost affectionately, but Vivian felt the words land like a hand closing loosely around her wrist, not gripping yet, just letting her know it could. "I don't know what you think you heard," Vivian said, keeping her voice as flat as the marble bar beneath her glass. "But I'd think carefully before you decide it's worth repeating." Marcus only smiled wider, the particular smile of a man who has already decided something is useful and is simply waiting for the right moment to spend it. "I'm sure it's nothing," he said in a tone that made clear he believed the opposite, and excused himself toward another conversation, leaving Vivian standing at the bar with her pulse ticking faster than she wanted to admit. She thought of the board meeting scheduled for next month, of the merger discussions, still delicate enough to be derailed by the wrong kind of headline, of exactly how much Marcus still resented losing his seat at the table 3 years ago, and how patiently he had waited in her experience for chances to take something back. She thought, too, unwillingly, of Daniel's voice saying there's a difference between fixing and helping, and wondered with a coldness that felt almost like fear what Marcus would do with a story about a woman who tested every man for money and had finally quietly found one who didn't want any. The magazine arrived on Daniel's workbench, the way most disasters do, quietly disguised as something ordinary. It was Marta from the print shop next door who brought it over, dropping the glossy issue of Meridian Business Quarterly onto the counter with the casual cruelty of someone who has no idea she is holding a match near dry paper. "Thought you'd want to see this," she said, tapping the cover. "Didn't you do some cabinets for Cole Atelier? That's the CEO, isn't it?" Daniel glanced up from the drawer runner he was fitting, wiped his hands, and looked down at the cover more out of politeness than curiosity. Vivian Cole stood there in a charcoal suit against a skyline backdrop, arms crossed. The headline beneath her reading, "The Woman Who Rebuilt an Empire Alone." For a full 3 seconds, Daniel simply looked at the photograph the way a person looks at an optical illusion, waiting for the image to resolve into something that made sense. And then it did, all at once, with the force of a door slamming somewhere behind his ribs. He knew that face. He knew it from 4 minutes in the rain, from a folder that had said Cole Atelier in plain black letters, from a woman who had introduced herself with the phrase, something like that, and let him fill in the rest with whatever assumption was convenient. He picked up the magazine and read the first paragraph, then the second, his jaw tightening with each line. Learning in the space of 90 seconds facts about a woman he had spent 2 weeks quietly, cautiously beginning to trust. Vivian Cole. Not an assistant, not a project manager, not someone who worked for the company in any sense that left room for ambiguity. The woman who owned it. The woman whose net worth the article listed in a pull quote large enough that Marta had circled it with her finger before wandering back to her own shop, oblivious to the damage she'd left behind. Sophie was at school, which Daniel would later be grateful for because it meant no one witnessed the particular stillness that came over him. The controlled quiet of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the last 2 weeks. He thought of the fabric swatches, the delivery timelines, the design revisions that had required her personal opinion. Every single one of them thin enough that he'd noticed at the time and dismissed the thought as flattering himself. He thought of her crouched on his workshop floor, discussing a wooden horse's ambitions with his daughter, and felt something curdle in his chest. Not because the moment had been fake, he didn't believe that, not really, but because he had let himself believe he understood the shape of what was happening between them, and it turned out he'd been looking at maybe a third of the picture. She had known who she was the entire time. He had not known who she was at all. That asymmetry sat in his stomach like a stone. He didn't call her. He told himself this was restraint, though it was closer to something raw, a need to sit alone with the feeling before he let anyone, even himself, talk him out of it. Vivian found out from Renata, who mentioned in passing that a Meridian feature had run that week, and something in Daniel's absence over the following 2 days, no calls about the commission, no unexpected visits, told her before she confirmed it that he already knew. She went to the workshop on the 3rd evening after closing, using the key code he'd given her for deliveries. A small act of trust she had not fully registered as significant until she stood in the dim shop debating whether using it now, uninvited, was itself a kind of violation. Daniel was there later than usual, running a hand plane along a table edge with more force than the wood required. He looked up when the bell chimed, and his face did not do the thing it usually did when he saw her. No half smile, no easy warmth. "You could have told me," he said before she'd said anything at all. "Weeks. 2 weeks of fabric samples and timeline questions, and you never once thought to mention you own the company, that you're worth more than every shop on this block combined." "I wasn't hiding it to hurt you," Vivian said, and heard how thin the defense sounded even as she offered it. "I wasn't sure how to bring it up without changing how you looked at me." "It changed the second I found out anyway," Daniel said. "Except now it feels like something you did to me, instead of something I got to understand on my own." He set the plane down, and his voice, when it continued, had lost its earlier heat and gone quieter, more dangerous for it. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it. Is this a habit of yours? Meeting people, not telling them who you are? Seeing how they act before you decide if they pass some test?" Vivian opened her mouth to deny it, and found she couldn't not honestly not to a man who had just watched her circle the truth for 2 weeks. "Yes," she said finally. "After Marcus, after Grant, after enough men who saw the balance sheet before they saw anything else, I started doing it without fully deciding to. Watching how people act before money enters the equation. It became a kind of reflex." "So I was a test," Daniel said, and it wasn't quite a question. "You weren't supposed to be," Vivian said. "You weren't ever supposed to matter enough to test. I came to your shop for a commission, and then I kept coming back because I wanted to, not because I was measuring you against anyone." "But you didn't correct it," Daniel said. "You let me believe you were someone else for 2 weeks, and the entire time some part of you was still checking whether I'd ask for anything the moment I found out the truth." The accuracy of it hit harder than an accusation would have, because there was no cruelty in his voice, only a flat, exhausted disappointment that felt worse than anger. "That's not fair," Vivian said, though the protest came out weaker than she wanted. "I have a company depending on me making decisions with a clear head. Do you understand what it's like to never know if someone's kindness has a price attached? I built a rule because the rule kept me from being hurt the same way twice." "I understand that," Daniel said, and for a moment, something in his expression gentled, an old ache surfacing behind his eyes that had nothing to do with her. "I understand it better than you probably think. Sophie's mother didn't leave because of money, Vivian. She left because raising a kid with a man who worked 80 hours a week building someone else's company wasn't the life she signed up for. And when I quit that job to build something of my own instead, something smaller, something honest, she was already gone before I finished explaining why I'd done it. I know what it's like to build a life around protecting yourself from being disappointed again. I built a whole workshop out of that instinct. But I don't test people to make sure they deserve me before I let them in. I just try to be honest and hope the other person is too." "I wanted to tell you," Vivian said. "Every time I saw Sophie, every time you looked at me like I was just some woman who happened to be there, I wanted to tell you, and I kept finding reasons to wait one more visit. And now I don't know which parts were real," Daniel said, and the words landed exactly as heavily as he intended them to. "I don't know if you liked spending time here, or if some part of you was auditing me the whole time, checking off boxes, watching to see when I'd slip and ask about your money. I've got a daughter who already lost one parent's full attention to something that turned out to be more important than her. I'm not going to let her get attached to someone who's running an experiment on her father." Vivian felt something in her chest crack at the mention of Sophie, at the plain protective logic of it, because she understood exactly what it meant to guard a child from becoming collateral damage in an adult's unfinished business. And she had no argument against it that didn't sound like special pleading. "I would never use her," Vivian said quietly. "Whatever you think of me right now, please believe that much." "I want to," Daniel said. "But I don't know how to separate the woman who helped Sophie name a wooden horse from the woman who spent 2 weeks deciding whether I'd pass a test I didn't know I was taking. I think I need some distance until I figure that out. Not forever, just until I trust my own read on this again." He didn't raise his voice, didn't slam anything, simply stated it the way he stated facts about lumber and delivery schedules. And somehow that steadiness made it land harder than shouting would have. Vivian left the workshop without arguing further, because arguing felt like exactly the kind of pressure that would prove every doubt he had. And she drove home through streets that had gone dark while they talked, replaying the conversation with the same relentless precision she brought to dissecting a failed negotiation. Somewhere in the replaying, underneath the sting of being seen so clearly and found wanting, she recognized a smaller, colder thread of worry that had nothing to do with Daniel's disappointment at all. If Meridian Business Quarterly had run a profile connecting her name to a small restoration shop, however incidentally, then somewhere out there, Marcus Whitfield was almost certainly reading it too, filing away exactly the kind of detail he had once been so skilled at turning into leverage. She thought of his voice at the auction light, and knowing people talk, and felt the two fears braid together into something considerably heavier than either alone. The fear of having already lost something real through her own defensiveness, and the fear that she had not yet begun to understand how much more there was still to lose. The boardroom on the 40th floor had a view that usually calmed Vivian before difficult meetings. The city laid out flat and orderly beneath glass, every problem reduced to a manageable scale from that height. It did nothing for her the morning of the merger vote. She had spent the previous 2 weeks rebuilding herself into something steadier than the woman who had walked out of Daniel's workshop, and she had decided somewhere around 3 in the morning 11 days ago that she was done running the quiet test that had cost her the one relationship in years that hadn't been built around her balance sheet. She had written him a letter instead of calling because she wanted him to have time to read it without her voice pressuring an answer out of him. And in it, she had said the truest thing she knew how to say, that she had built a rule to protect herself from being loved for the wrong reasons, and had ended up punishing the one person who had never given her a reason to. She had asked for nothing back, except the chance to prove it slowly, without any more tests. She had not heard from him yet, and she told herself that silence did not mean refusal, only that trust, once cracked, took longer to reset than an apology could account for. She had also decided in that same 3 in the morning clarity to bring Daniel to the merger gala the following week publicly, not as a secret indulgence tucked behind press releases, but as a person she was choosing to be seen with. She had told her board this in the softest language she could manage, framing it as a simple personal matter that had no bearing on Cole Atelier's business decisions, and most of them had nodded and moved on to spreadsheets. Only Renata had caught her eye afterward, with an expression that said she understood exactly how much courage that soft sentence had cost. The merger vote should have been the biggest event of Vivian's week. It became something else entirely at 11:40 that morning when a board member named Harold Cho slid his phone across the table toward her without a word, the screen already open to a gossip site that specialized in exactly this kind of story, headlined in letters designed to be shared before they were read. Billionaire CEO's secret romance with single dad is a publicity stunt ahead of major merger source claims. Vivian's stomach dropped before she'd even finished the headline, and it dropped further with each paragraph beneath it, which detailed with uncomfortable specificity her visits to Rhea's restoration, the timeline of the commission that had thinned out into personal calls, and a quote attributed to an unnamed source close to the company, claiming Vivian had orchestrated the entire relationship as a piece of image management. A heartwarming underdog love story designed to soften public perception of Cole Atelier, right as merger negotiations with a notoriously image-conscious partner company reached their final stage. The article even mentions Sophie by description, though not by name, a small girl being used, the piece implied, as an emotional prop in a corporate narrative. "Is any of this true?" Harold asked, not unkindly, but with the flat caution of a man whose job depended on knowing the answer before the market did. Because if a single reporter can prove Cole Atelier manufactured a relationship to influence merger sentiment, we don't just lose the deal. We lose credibility with every partner we've ever worked with. Vivian read the article twice more before she trusted her voice enough to answer, feeling something close to vertigo. The specific horror of watching something private and unfinished get flattened into a story that was almost, but not quite, unrecognizable. "It's not true," she said. "I did not fabricate anything. But I understand exactly how it looks, and I understand why you're asking." She thought instantly of Marcus, the ease with which the details lined up, the timeline accurate enough to have come from someone who'd been watching closely, the framing calculated enough to have come from someone who understood precisely which fear would move a boardroom fastest. She excused herself before the vote could proceed, citing the need to address the story directly, and the moment she was in the hallway, she called Marcus's number from memory, something she had not done in 3 years. And he answered on the second ring in a voice so pleasant it made her want to break something. "Vivian," he said. "I assume you're calling about the article." "You assume correctly," she said, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will. "You knew I'd see it, so let's skip the part where you pretend surprise. What do you want, Marcus?" There was a pause. the pause of a man enjoying being asked directly for once, instead of having to maneuver toward the question himself. "I want what I was owed 3 years ago," he said. "You had your family's board vote me out the moment the marriage fell apart, Vivian, like I was a liability, instead of someone who helped keep that company solvent for 2 years. I built relationships, I brought in capital, and the moment our arrangement ended, I became nothing to all of you. I want a seat back at the table, not out of love, don't worry, purely business. And I think a merger vote thrown into chaos by a scandal is a very persuasive argument for why the board needs steadier, more experienced hands involved again. Hands like mine. You'd destroy a man's reputation and frighten his daughter's world to get a board seat," Vivian said, disgust flattening her voice into something almost calm. "You're describing yourself like a wronged party, but you're the one who married me for leverage in the first place, Marcus. Don't dress this up as justice." "Call it what you like," Marcus said. "The story's already out. You can spend the next week trying to unwind it, or you can call me back when you're ready to discuss terms." He hung up before she could answer, and Vivian stood in the hallway outside the boardroom with her phone still pressed to her ear, feeling the particular fury of being cornered by someone who had once known her well enough to know exactly where to press. The story reached Daniel within the hour. Not through any effort of his own, but because Marta from the print shop burst into the workshop holding her own phone aloft like evidence at a trial, breathless with the specific excitement of someone delivering gossip they believe to be helpful. "Daniel, you need to see this. It's everywhere," she said, and thrust the screen at him before he could stop her. He read it standing at the counter, with Sophie's crayon drawing of Bishoot the racehorse/unicorn still taped beside the register. And the words landed in a place that had already been raw for 2 weeks, reopening it entirely. A publicity stunt. His daughter described, however carefully anonymized, as an emotional prop in someone else's business strategy. He thought of every genuine moment he had let himself believe in Vivian on the floor discussing wooden horses, Vivian staying quietly while he solved a lumber crisis instead of buying her way past it, and felt those memories curdle under the weight of a headline that suggested they had all been engineered for an audience he never knew was watching. He did not call Vivian. He turned off his phone entirely, picked Sophie up from school early, and spent the rest of the day trying not to imagine reporters finding their address, trying not to let the old, familiar fear settle back into permanent residence in his chest. The fear that he had once again built a life around someone whose priorities did not actually include him. Vivian spent the next 36 hours doing the only thing she knew how to do under siege, working the problem from every angle at once. She hired a forensic communications firm to trace the article's sourcing and had a preliminary answer by that evening. A metadata trail suggesting the tip had originated from an account linked 2 shell layers removed to a consulting firm Marcus had quietly taken a position with 8 months earlier. She contacted the reporter directly off the record and confirmed what she already suspected, that the source had provided a timeline suspiciously detailed for someone with no direct access to Cole Atelier's internal calendar details that could only have come from someone who'd once had legitimate access to her scheduling system during their marriage and had apparently kept it. She assembled the evidence not to punish Marcus out of spite, though the satisfaction of that would not have troubled her conscience, but because the board needed proof before the merger partners' legal team started asking harder questions. And because Daniel deserved more than anyone to know exactly whose hands had reached into his life and rearranged it without his permission. She went to the workshop on the second evening after Marta had confirmed Daniel had picked Sophie up early and not returned since, and found the shop locked, the windows dark. A small handwritten sign taped inside the glass reading, "Closed for personal reasons." She stood outside it longer than she should have, coat collar up against a wind that had turned sharp with early autumn, and thought about every version of herself that had led to this moment. The woman who tested love before trusting it. The woman who had built an empire out of the wreckage of one bad marriage, and then built emotional armor thick enough to survive 100 more, only to discover that armor could just as easily keep out the one thing worth letting in. She did not knock. She left instead a folder taped to the door beside the handwritten sign containing the forensic report, the metadata trail, and a single page in her own handwriting that said only, "I did not build this with you to use it against anyone. I built it because for the first time in years, I wanted something that had nothing to do with strategy. If you never open this door to me again, I understand. But I needed you to know the truth landed on your daughter's world because of someone else's cruelty, not because of mine." She was 3 blocks away, sitting in the back of her car, with her forehead against the cold window, when her phone rang with a number she hadn't saved but recognized instantly by the area code alone. She answered before the second ring finished. "I read it," Daniel said, and his voice sounded tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. The tiredness of a man who had spent 2 days rebuilding a wall only to have someone hand him proof that the wall might have been built against the wrong person. "The metadata, the consulting firm, all of it. Vivian. Is this the same man from your marriage?" "Yes," she said quietly. "Marcus. He wants a board seat. He decided destroying my credibility and by extension yours was worth the leverage." There was a long silence on the line, long enough that Vivian thought he might have hung up. And then Daniel spoke again, slower, this time choosing each word with visible care. "I spent 2 days assuming the worst version of you," he said. "That you'd built something real, just to abandon it the moment it stopped being convenient, or worse, that it was never real to begin with. I let 2 years of being left behind color the last 2 weeks before I even asked you a single question. I owe you an apology for that, whatever else is still true." "You don't owe me anything," Vivian said. "I gave you every reason to doubt me before Marcus ever opened his mouth. I understand if trusting this again feels impossible." "It doesn't feel impossible," Daniel said. "It feels like something I want to try harder at than I've tried at anything in years. But I need you to understand something too. Sophie asked me tonight why the lady with the pretty dress doesn't come around anymore. And I didn't have an answer that didn't sound like I was protecting her from something that scared me more than it scared her. I don't want to keep protecting her from you, Vivian. I want to figure out how to let her back into something good, if it really is good." Vivian closed her eyes, feeling something in her chest loosen for the first time in 2 days. "It's good," she said. "I'll spend as long as it takes proving that to both of you." "Then come by tomorrow," Daniel said. "Not for a commission. Just come by." And for the first time since the headline had broken, Vivian let herself believe that whatever Marcus had built to destroy her might in the end only succeed in showing her exactly what was worth fighting to keep. The emergency board session convened 4 days later in the same 40th floor room where the merger vote had stalled, though this time the mood in the room had shifted from cautious alarm to something closer to controlled fury, and Vivian intended to make sure that fury landed exactly where it belonged before the meeting ended. She had spent the previous 3 days building a case with the same discipline she brought to every negotiation that actually mattered, cross-referencing the forensic communications report against Marcus's consulting contract, tracing the exact date his firm had been retained by a mid-tier investment group circling Cole Atelier's merger partner, and confirming through a source inside that same investment group who owed her a favor from years earlier that Marcus had pitched the scandal not as an act of personal grievance, but as a calculated strategy, a way to destabilize the merger long enough for his new employer to negotiate better terms on the other side of the table. It was worse than she had assumed, and somehow that made it easier to face because it stripped away any lingering temptation to see Marcus as merely a wounded man lashing out, and revealed him instead as exactly what he had always been. A person who treated other people's lives as instruments to be played for his own advantage. She arrived early enough to speak privately with Harold Cho before the rest of the board filed in, laying the full report on the table between them without preamble. "I want you to read this before anyone else says a word," she said. "Not because I need you defending me. Because you asked me directly whether the story was true, and you deserve the truth in full before this board makes any decision that affects the merger." Harold read through it in silence, his expression shifting from skepticism to something graver as the pages turned. And when he finally looked up, his voice had lost the cautious neutrality it carried during the last session. "This isn't just personal history bleeding into business," he said. "This is a competitor's proxy interfering directly with a pending transaction. That's not a scandal we manage quietly, Vivian. That's something we take to council, and possibly to the SEC, depending on how deep his contract with that investment group goes." "I agree," Vivian said. "But before either of those things happen, I want him to hear it from me directly in this room, in front of the board he's trying to manipulate his way back onto." Marcus arrived 12 minutes late, which Vivian recognized immediately as a deliberate performance of unbothered confidence, the kind of small theater he had always been skilled at. He wore a suit clearly chosen for the occasion, dark and understated in the way that photographed as serious rather than desperate, and he took the open seat near the head of the table with the easy entitlement of a man who still on some level believed this boardroom belonged to him by right rather than by favor. "I appreciate the invitation," he said, glancing around at faces that were noticeably colder than he had anticipated. "Though I confess I expected a slightly warmer welcome given the circumstances." "The circumstances," Vivian said, "are that you orchestrated a false story about my personal life, endangered the well-being of a 5-year-old girl who has nothing to do with any of this, and did it all as a paid strategy for a competing investment group, hoping to sabotage this merger for their own leverage. I'd say the welcome is exactly as warm as it should be." Marcus's smile faltered for the first time since he'd walked in, though he recovered it quickly, leaning back in his chair with practiced ease. "That's a serious accusation, Vivian. I'd be careful throwing it around a room full of lawyers." "It's not an accusation," Vivian said, sliding a copy of the forensic report down the table toward him. "It's documentation. Every board member here has already seen it. The metadata trail connecting the leaked story to your consulting firm's IP address. The retainer agreement your firm signed with Hartwell Capital 11 days before the article ran. The same Hartwell Capital that has spent the last 2 months trying to insert itself into our merger negotiations as a third-party broker." "You didn't come here today to reclaim a board seat out of old resentment, Marcus. You came here because destabilizing this deal was worth money to the people paying you, and my personal life happened to be the most convenient weapon available." The room had gone very quiet. The particular silence of people watching a carefully constructed story collapse in real time. Marcus's eyes moved across the table, cataloging the expressions of board members who only a week earlier might have entertained his pitch about steadier hands and experienced judgment, and finding instead a row of faces that had already made up their minds. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice losing some of its polish. "I provided some general market commentary to Hartwell as part of ordinary consulting work. I had no control over what a reporter decided to publish or how they sourced it." "Your firm's metadata says otherwise," Harold said flatly, tapping the report in front of him. "And frankly, Marcus, even if we set aside the legal exposure, which we won't, the ethical exposure alone disqualifies you from ever sitting at this table again. You used a child as a talking point in a smear campaign to manipulate a business deal. There isn't a version of that story where you walk out of here with anything but a lawsuit. Marcus opened his mouth to argue further, and Vivian watched something in him recalibrate mid-sentence, the particular pivot of a man realizing the room had already turned against him and searching too late for any exit that preserved even a shred of dignity. He found none. He stood eventually, straightened his jacket with more composure than the moment deserved, and said only, "I'll have my attorney contact yours," before walking out of the boardroom for what both of them understood would be the last time. The vote on the merger passed 40 minutes later, unanimous, and Vivian's public statement went out that same afternoon, brief and precise, confirming that a former business associate had fabricated the story as part of an attempt to manipulate merger negotiations, that legal action was already underway, and that the relationship described in the article, while private, had never been anything but genuine. She did not name Marcus directly in the statement on the advice of counsel, but the phrasing left little room for public confusion about who bore responsibility. And by evening, the same outlets that had run the original headline were quietly running corrections, the story shifting almost overnight from scandal to cautionary tale about corporate sabotage. She went to the workshop that evening, not because she had anything left to prove, but because Daniel had asked her to come, plainly without conditions. And she found him waiting on the front step with Sophie already asleep against his shoulder, worn out from a full day of preschool and the general exhaustion of being 5. "I saw the statement," he said as Vivian climbed the 2 low steps to stand beside him. "Harold called me too, actually. Said he wanted me to hear directly that the board understands none of it was ever about strategy on your end." Vivian felt something in her chest ease at that, at the specific kindness of Harold making that call unprompted, and found herself momentarily unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Daniel studied her for a long moment in the porch light, his free hand coming up to brush a strand of hair back from her face, with a gentleness that felt like an entirely different language than every gesture Marcus had ever offered her. "I've been thinking about what you said in that letter," he said quietly. "About wanting something that had nothing to do with strategy for the first time in years. I want you to know I believe that. Not because the report cleared you, because I watched you sit on my workshop floor discussing a wooden horse's career prospects with more patience than most executives give their actual employees, and no consultant hired for a publicity stunt does that unscripted, 3 separate times for 2 weeks straight without an audience watching." Vivian laughed despite herself, the sound coming out thick with relief. "Biscuit's career is a serious matter," she said. "Racehorse or unicorn, the stakes are enormous." "Exactly," Daniel said, smiling properly now, the first full smile she'd seen from him since the article broke. "You understood that instinctively. Nobody fakes understanding Biscuit's stakes." They sat together on the porch step for a long while after that, Sophie still sleeping soundly against her father's shoulder, and Vivian found herself talking more openly than she had in years. Not about the merger or the board or Marcus, but about her grandmother, the woman who had given her the monogrammed handkerchief still folded somewhere in a drawer in Daniel's workshop, and about the particular loneliness of building an empire that everyone wanted a piece of, and almost no one wanted simply to sit beside. Daniel listened the way he always had, without performing sympathy, without angling toward anything, simply present in a way that felt, after everything, like the safest place Vivian had occupied in longer than she could remember. "I don't want to go back to testing people," she said eventually. "I want to try trusting instead, even when it's frightening." "Especially when it's frightening. I think that's the only way it means anything." "Good," Daniel said. "Because I don't think I could survive another round of fabric swatches as an excuse to see me. Just come by because you want to. That's the only test I ever wanted to pass, and the only one I ever wanted to give." The following weeks unfolded with a quiet, ordinary steadiness that Vivian had not realized she'd been starving for her entire adult life. She began arriving at the workshop without pretexts, sometimes simply to sit on the overturned crate near the window while Daniel worked, sometimes to help Sophie paint increasingly elaborate features onto Biscuit, whose racehorse unicorn identity crisis was eventually resolved by unanimous vote in favor of unicorn, complete with a horn Daniel carved himself out of leftover walnut. Renata, watching Vivian's calendar fill with unfamiliar blocks of unscheduled time on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, allowed herself exactly one comment on the matter, remarking that she'd never seen Vivian answer emails with quite so many typos, and Vivian had laughed instead of correcting her, which Renata took correctly as confirmation of everything she'd already suspected. The gala Vivian had once planned as a public declaration became in the end something smaller and truer than the performance she'd originally imagined. She invited Daniel not as a statement to the press, but simply because she wanted him there. And when reporters did notice them together, exactly as she'd expected they might, she found she no longer flinched at the attention the way she once would have. Because there was nothing left to defend, no test being administered, no story being managed. Only two people who had chosen each other after every reason not to had already been laid bare and survived. Daniel wore a suit that fit him with the same understated ease he brought to everything uncomfortable in the unfamiliar formality, but unwilling to let that discomfort show in front of Sophie, who insisted on inspecting his tie no fewer than 4 times before declaring him with the solemn authority of a 5-year-old fashion critic, sufficiently princely for the evening. Marcus's legal troubles, which Vivian tracked with clinical detachment rather than vindictive satisfaction, resolved over the following months in exactly the direction the forensic evidence had promised. A settlement that stripped him of any remaining consulting relationships in the industry, and a quiet but thorough blacklisting among the exact circles he had once relied on for relevance. Vivian did not celebrate his downfall so much as simply let it happen, occupied as she was with matters that mattered far more. A merger that closed successfully. A workshop that began taking on larger commissions, once word spread that Reyes Restoration had weathered a media storm with its reputation intact, and a small girl who had begun without any prompting from either adult, referring to Vivian as her friend, instead of the lady with the pretty dress, a promotion Vivian privately considered more meaningful than any headline Meridian Business Quarterly had ever run about her. On a quiet evening, nearly 6 months after the rain-soaked night they'd first met, Daniel found Vivian in the workshop long after closing, examining a small cedar box he'd been building in secret for weeks, tucked away on a high shelf where Sophie wouldn't stumble across it during her frequent explorations. Vivian turned it over in her hands, admiring the careful joinery, the way the grain had been chosen and matched with obvious deliberation, and looked up to find Daniel watching her, with an expression that made her pulse quicken before he'd said a single word. "I'm not going to pretend I have some elaborate speech prepared," he said, taking the box gently from her hands and opening it to reveal a plain gold band, simple in a way that felt entirely deliberate, chosen by a man who had learned exactly what kind of gesture Vivian actually wanted, rather than the kind the world expected her to receive. "I'm not asking because of anything you own, or anything I could gain from it. I'm asking because Sophie already thinks of you as family, and because I haven't wanted anything this plainly in longer than I can remember, and because you're the first person in years who's made me believe wanting something simple doesn't make it small." Vivian felt tears gather before she could stop them, thinking of Grant's ring throwing chandelier light across a marble floor months earlier, of every proposal that had come wrapped in disclosure schedules and quiet calculations, and understood with absolute clarity the difference between being asked and being appraised. "Yes," she said before he'd even finished the question properly, and laughed at her own eagerness, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Yes, obviously yes. Ask me the actual question so I can say it properly." Daniel laughed too low and warm and asked her properly, and she answered properly. And somewhere in the back room, Sophie, who had crept out of bed under the flimsy cover of needing water, watched the entire scene from the doorway, with the deep, satisfied approval of a child whose princess theory had finally triumphantly been confirmed. They married the following spring in a small ceremony that Vivian insisted stay modest, despite her assistant's gentle protests about press expectations. Held in the workshop itself, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and cedar, rather than any ballroom Vivian had ever set foot in for business. Sophie served as flower girl, with the fierce concentration of someone executing an important professional duty, scattering petals with the same care she brought to Biscuit's grooming routine. And when Daniel and Vivian exchanged vows, they kept them simple, promising nothing about balance sheets or empires or tests passed, only the plain, durable thing that had grown between them in the space of 4 minutes in the rain, and had somehow, against every defense Vivian had spent years constructing, turned out to be exactly enough. Vivian Cole, who had once measured every man against the worst thing love had ever cost her, stood in the converted warehouse smelling of fresh-cut wood, and finally understood. Watching Daniel's steady hands and Sophie's solemn petal scattering, that the truest wealth she had ever built was not the empire bearing her name, but the small, ordinary, unguarded life she had almost let herself walk away from, and had chosen in the end to keep.